Well, thank you. I do have some product back there, and they gave me a couple of things to advertise. This little book is entitled Effortless Change, which sounds impossible, but it really is true if you do it God's way. If you plant a seed, seeds don't struggle to bring forth fruit. It's their nature to do it. And if you do it God's way and take the seed of God's Word and just put it in your heart, it will change you effortlessly. So this is a great truth. And this book here is like elementary for all Christians. This is basic Christianity, and it's harmonizing the wrath and the punishment of the Old Testament with the mercy and the grace of the New Testament. And if you don't understand this, you'll at the very least get a schizophrenic impression of God and think that He's, changed somehow or another, and yet He doesn't change. There was a reason that there was wrath and punishment in the Old Testament, and this explains the difference. I'm going to let Julianne give those to people that look like you really need help understanding the nature of God. So it looks like I have an hour, is that correct? I've said on the clock back there. All right, so actually, I ought to have Jamie be teaching this on marriage. She's the one that's had to put up with me and do things, but she doesn't like getting in front of people and teaching, so I'm going to have to do this. But let me start over here in James. What'd you say? Yeah. Well, Jamie definitely has an opinion, and she's definitely got ideas, but she just doesn't like to express them publicly. I hear them. But let me start over here in James chapter 3. This is something that most people have heard, but really I don't think we put the importance on this that we should. But in James 3:16, it says, "For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work." That's one of the most amazing passages of Scripture in the entire Word of God. This says that every evil work is present where there is envy and strife. And so I'm using this just to highlight that this is deadly, and I don't think most people fully recognize this. A lot of people just, they accept strife levels that are unacceptable. We had one guy that was in one of our churches that, it's a long story, but he and his wife had lived in a nudist colony for 3 years before they came to church, and they got born again. And anyway, within a short period of time, he was just causing all kinds of strife in the church. And so he came to me and he says, "I'm leaving this place." He says, "There's nothing but strife here." And I said, "Well, yeah, there's a lot of strife, and you're the source of it." He criticized people over everything. If they wore deodorant, that wasn't natural, and he could have used a little deodorant. And he criticized you if you peeled your potatoes, because that was the most, healthy part of it. And he just was critical of everybody. So anyway, I said, "Yeah, there's a lot of strife in this church, and you're the source of it. You caused all of this." And I didn't know how he was going to respond, but instead of getting mad, he just said, "I don't know how to be any other way." And he told me he was the first person in the history of California that was ever indicted by the grand jury 3 times before he was a teenager. And he had lived in reformatories and things like this, and he says, "I don't even know what you're talking about. How do you live without strife?" So the point I'm making is, see, his perspective on what's normal was so different, and people bring their perspective and what they're used to and the way things were in their home into a marriage, and they just tolerate strife and stuff. And yet, this says that this opens up a door to every evil work. Not some, but every evil work. I was in a church in Corpus Christi, Texas, and there was a boy who died they buried him 2 days before I got there, and this church had just started believing what Jim was teaching last night, that it's God's will to heal every time. It was an Assembly of God church, and they hadn't believed that, and so this was a major switch for them to start believing in healing for every person. And yet this boy, the whole church fasted and prayed for him, and he died. And because of it, the church was just in turmoil and wondering whether this was the right thing to do or not. And so I went out with the parents of that child for 3 days, Monday through Wednesday, and just tried to find out what was going on. And anyway, as I talked to them, there was so much strife in the home, they were talking about getting a divorce. And they just, it was terrible, the things that were going on. And the day that this happened to this boy, the mother got so mad at him, she just cussed him out and said, "Leave, I don't ever want to see you again." And so he went to school that day, broke the school rules, went over to a friend's house, and they were playing Russian roulette with a gun, and he shot himself in the head. And that's the reason that he went into this coma. And then the church went to praying and fasting and believing that he was going to be raised, up from this coma, and yet he died, and they just couldn't understand why it happened. Now, what Jim was teaching last night, that doesn't disqualify you or mean that you can't be healed, but it does mean that when you sit there and give Satan an inroad like this, that this is how all this stuff happened, is through strife. And there's people that just tolerate strife and think that it's okay. It's not. And so in marriage, this is one of the things that we have to deal with, is get to where we can walk in harmony with people and not tolerate those levels of strife. And, many times people treat others better than they treat their own mate, which to me is just weird. It's weird. My brother, he's not Spirit-filled. He loves the Lord. He leads people to the Lord. He's a good guy. But one thing he does that is good, he told his wife when they got married, just a few weeks after they got married, some people were coming over to the house to eat, and she was getting out the china and the crystal and the silverware, all of this stuff. And he asked why she was getting this stuff out. And she says, "Well, we got company coming over for dinner." And he put it all back up. And he says, "From now on, we'll use this stuff for my family, and we'll use the other stuff for guests." He says, "We're going to treat my family better than we treat other people." But there's people that actually have a double standard. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to go see a movie that was not really a good movie. And so I asked my dad in front of these other people if I could go. And he said no at first. And I began to start whining and complaining about it. And so he says, "Okay, you can go." And when I got home, I got a spanking. And he says, "Now, I wouldn't say something in front of people, but he says, when we're in front of people, we might let you do some things, but at home, boy, you're going to suffer for it." And anyway, there was a double standard that, you treat around other people, you try and present a picture of things being better than what they are. And that's just terrible. I actually was counseling a guy one time, he and his wife, and as they described what was going on, I told this guy, I said, "You're the problem." I said, "Man, and I just started laying into this guy and saying, you're the problem why all of these things are happening." And boy, you could tell he didn't like it, and he bristled up, but then he controlled himself and he says, "Well, you might be right." And I said, "What would have happened if your wife would have said that?" It would have been World War III. See, he controlled himself speaking to me and treated me better than he would treat his mate. This double standard where we just allow strife in our home and things like this, it's deadly. You can't do that. And so you've got to deal with this strife. And this is what I want to really focus on today, is to talk about how do you deal with strife? How do you deal with the problems in marriage? And Dwayne gave me just a real brief synopsis of things he'll be talking about, and they're going to be talking about steps and things, and all of that's great. But again, I'm just going to be talking about a generality that applies to not only marriage, it applies to every single thing. How do you deal with strife when somebody's rubbing you the wrong way, when there's contention or something like that? So I want to turn over to Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 10. And I happen to have a little booklet on this entitled "Self-Centeredness, the Source of All Grief." And it's my least requested teaching. But it's really good. I had one guy that actually was getting a divorce, and they had already filed for divorce. It hadn't been final yet, and he listened to this teaching, and man, he started repenting, went to his wife, they listened to it, and they put the marriage back together, and they've been teaching marriage seminars for over 20 years. And so this really is the root of all grief. It is not your mate that's the problem. It says here in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 10, it says, "Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom." And if you look that up in the Hebrew, it means only by pride comes contention. The only thing that makes people angry, that causes contention, and if you compare this with Proverbs chapter 17, verse 14, let me just flip over there and read this real quickly. It shows you that contention is just the beginning of strife. In verse 14, it says, "The beginning of strife is as when one letteth out water. Therefore leave off contention before it be meddled with." So contention is just the beginning of strife, the beginning stages. And it says only by pride comes contention. So the only thing that really makes you angry is not what the people do to you, it's pride. It's what's on the inside of you that makes you angry. That's radical, and most people don't agree with that. Again, I've had a lot of people come to me and they'll tell me what's happening, and every time they talk about that they've gotten hurt or bitter or something that's happened to them, they will immediately refer to what somebody did to them as justification for the way that they feel. That's wrong. You can control how you feel regardless of what other people do to you. And this is a new wrinkle in most people's brains. Most people think that, no, you can't control that. It's a response. This person did this to me. Again, Jesus on the cross, he forgave the very people that were crucifying him, said, "Father, forgive them." He showed love and mercy. He told us to turn the other cheek. And he told us to do things. And most people they feel completely justified in getting angry over things that happen. But again, that is wrong. You can get to a place to where you are not offended at the things that people say to you. And again, most people just think this is impossible. You can't live this way. And I'm sure that God laid this on my heart for all of the people that didn't come here. This probably doesn't apply to any of you that are here on a Thursday morning. But see, this is actually freedom because you can't control other people. The only thing you can do is control yourself, and the sad fact is most of us don't control ourselves. But you can get to a place to where you are not operating in pride. And again, I need to define some things because most people think of pride as arrogance. And that's one manifestation of pride. But it's like if you had a stick, and if you were holding a stick, it's got two opposite ends to it. And one end of that might be arrogance, but the other end of that is low self-esteem. That is pride. Pride is just simple Pride. I is the center of pride. Sin, S-I-N. I is the center of sin. Pride, in its simplest terms, is just self-centeredness. You are thinking about yourself. You are thinking about things from your own perspective. You aren't considering the other person. You know, somebody pulls in front of you in traffic and cuts you off, and you immediately think, how dare them do this to me? And you don't even think about what they're doing. They may have, come from the doctor's office and just found out they've got a death sentence. They only got a few days to live. Or maybe they're coming from a funeral and somebody died and they were thinking about something else. It's not always malicious why people do things, but we just look at things from our perspective, and this person did this to me. You don't even think about why they did what they did. Yeah. But see, if you were to think about the other person, it would totally change the way that you view things. I was watching a show one time, and it was against capital punishment. And they were trying to teach you, they were trying to turn your opinion so that you were against capital punishment. You know, I'm not excited about it. It's not something that blesses me, but the Scriptures teach that if you kill somebody, that your life needs to be given in return for that. That's in Genesis 9. Some people teach that that's Old Testament. Things have changed. We could debate that. But nonetheless, I believe in capital punishment. I believe it's a deterrent, and I believe that there are some times that you need to do it. And so I believed in capital punishment, but what they did, they showed this guy that was in prison for rape and murder, and they showed him sitting in his jail cell, and then they went to black and white and played this real sad music and showed him sitting there and showed you how oppressed he was. And then they went down the hall, and this is when they had the electric chair, and they showed that he was going to be electrocuted, and they started showing things, and it made you feel sorry for this guy. And then they went back to his baby pictures, and they showed you when he was a kid. And you think about someday we're going to kill this little baby regardless of what they've done. And they showed him playing, you know, and having a stick horse and doing these things and playing. And then they showed that he was sexually abused, and he had all of these things, and he had a traumatic childhood and all of this. And then they brought you up to where he was. And when you saw his story, you couldn't help but feel sympathy and pity and think, is there something else that we could do? And so even though I believed in capital punishment, I was sitting there empathizing with this guy and feeling sorry for him and thinking that, man, maybe there's bound to be some other way. And as I was watching this, I just thought about, but God, how do I square this with Scripture? And the Lord just spoke to me, and He says, what if you took the same audience that's watching this and you showed the girls baby pictures and showed her being pure and her playing, you know, as a little kid and doing things, and then some pervert comes into her life and just for self-gratification rapes her, and then isn't even man enough to face what he's done and face the consequences, and so he kills her trying to cover up his crime. He says if you took the same people watching his side of the story and showed them the girl's side of the story, those same people would want to become a vigilante committee and kill the guy. And the Lord was showing me, it just depends on how you look at things. How you look at things. If you look at everything through the glass of look what happened to me, if everything is all about you, then you are going to live a life of offense. And you're going to have strife. And this says only by pride comes contention. The only reason that we are so offended and hurt over things is because our self is so important to us. And I won't take time this morning to teach on this, but in the New Testament, Jesus talked about it's in losing your life that you find your life. And it's more blessed to give than it is to receive, and on and on. And we have to die to ourselves. In the New Testament, it's established that we're supposed to love other people more than we love ourselves. Philippians chapter 2. And yet, very few Christians do this, and that's the reason that we get so ticked off and so offended and so upset when people do things for us. So the antidote to this isn't to solve everybody else and get everybody else how to, make marriage work. Jamie and I have been to some marriage seminars, and I'd say that the number one thing taught at marriage seminars, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today, so I'm not against it, but I'm saying probably the number one thing that people will talk about is that you need to communicate and that you need to dialogue. Instead of arguing and stuff, you need to listen to each other and stuff. But did you know, actually, that's just a byproduct of if you love the other person more than you love yourself. If you aren't self-centered, you would listen to that other person. So again, communication is good, but it has to be the right kind of communication. I actually had somebody that came to one of our marriage seminars, and they had been to a thing where they taught communication, and you had to sit down and write notes to each other, and they forced you to start writing notes and communicating. And this lady said it nearly ruined their marriage because all they had was hatred for each other, and they started communicating their hatred for each other, and it nearly destroyed their marriage. But did you know before you got married, you didn't have a problem communicating? Man, you'd stay on the phone or however it is that you communicate. You talked all the time and stuff. But if you love a person, if you love them more than you love yourself, you're going to talk to them. You're going to listen to them. You'll listen to their side of the story. So I believe that if you keep peeling the layers back, Communication is important, but communication is just a byproduct of not loving yourself. You love them. You think more about them than you think about yourself. You know, this is one of those things that Jamie would be so much better teaching this than I am. But when we first got married, I'm the kind that our family never observed Valentine's Day. I couldn't have even told you what month of the year it was. Matter of fact, when it came to birthdays, my family, the only thing I got was licks by my brother. He'd take me down and give me one lick for every year and one to grow on, and that's all he did. There might have been a couple of times I had a birthday cake, but we didn't observe birthdays. Days just weren't a big deal to us. So anyway, after we got married, it's totally my fault. I'm embarrassed to tell you these things, but I was taught by Kenneth Copeland that if you are in the ministry, you are sinning against God if you work a secular job. So when Jamie and I got married, we went on a honeymoon. After we got back from our honeymoon, I had $5,000 in the bank, and I went and changed it all into $100 bills and went to the 7-Eleven and gave them all away in 30 minutes. I couldn't wait to get out on faith. Boy, that was dumber than a bag of rocks. And I refused to work a job because I felt like I'm called to the ministry and I'm going to trust God. And because of it, man, we went through about 5 or 6 years of extreme poverty. I mean, long time later, Jamie, 8 months pregnant, went 2 weeks with nothing but water. I mean, that's all we had. And she was 8 months pregnant, and we struggled, and we went through financial problems. And so anyway, we were struggling, not just a few months after we got married. We got married in October, and so this was February, and I came home, and we hadn't eaten in days. We had nothing. And I say, when we have nothing, people talk about, that means all you've got is some canned goods, or you've got something that you don't really want to eat. But I mean, we had nothing. We had salt that we kept in the fridge so it wouldn't clump up in Texas. And that's all we had was some salt in the refrigerator. And we drank water out of the tap. And we were struggling, and man, we were hungry. And so I came home, and Jamie had saved up a little bit of cake mix. And on Valentine's Day, she made this sheet cake and put white icing on it and had red hots, I guess, and made a little heart that said, "I love you." And so she came out with that, and I saw it, and the first thing I thought was, you had food this whole time? We could have been eating. And I said, I don't care if you ever make me a Valentine's cake. I said, man, we could have been eating. And she was just smiling when she brought that out. And when I said that, she just got a frown. She never said a word. I tell you what, Jamie's been a blessing. I've put her through terrible things. I was sitting around with a group of pastors one time, and they were talking about how they committed adultery on their wife and how God put the marriage back together and forgave them another one, just terrible things that have happened. And then I got to talking about some of the financial things we went through, and these other ministers says, my God, you've treated Jamie worse than I ever treated my wife. And Jamie never said a word to me about those things. But when I left that place, I had to go somewhere, and I got in the car. I mean, God got on my case. And boy, he told me, don't you ever treat my daughter that way again. And I mean, I repented to God, and then I repented to Jamie. And since then, I have never missed an anniversary, a birthday, a Valentine's Day, or something like that. But see, that was just self-centeredness that made me think about just myself and not consider Jamie. And God dealt with me about it, and hopefully I'm doing better than what I was doing then. But it's our self-centeredness that causes all of these things. And Jamie, see, most people would sit there and say that she's justified in being upset, but instead she went to the Lord and prayed about it, and God got on my case. I talk for a living. That's what I do. And if Jamie and I get in an argument, I could out-talk her. But man, when she clams up and just goes to leaving it up to God, and I know something's going on and I have to pray about it, I lose every time. But when you get in and start defending yourself, when you start trying to fix everything yourself, you take it out of the hands of God. God says, vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord. He will repay. It really comes back to a lack of relationship with God. It comes back to a lack of humility. We think that we've got to deal with our mate, that we've got to fix all of these things, instead of just leaving things up to the Lord. So again, going back to defining what pride is, over in Numbers chapter 12, it talks about that Moses had Miriam and Aaron, his sister and brother-in-law, come out against him because he had married an Ethiopian woman. An Ethiopian was black, and he was, Oriental or Middle Eastern type of complexion. And so it was an interracial marriage, and they came out against him and spoke against him because of this interracial marriage. And it says that when that happened, that God struck her with leprosy, and Moses had to intercede for her. But right there in that deal, it says in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, in parentheses, after it talks about how they criticized Moses, it says, now Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. That is one awesome statement. Moses is one of the people that was used the most in the Old Testament. Man, we are talking about him thousands of years later, and yet Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. I think that is a prerequisite to God using you. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and James chapter 4, it talks about God resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. When you get into pride, you actually have God resist you, not in the sense that God doesn't love you or that He's mad at you, but God built His kingdom to function on humility. Jesus said Himself that I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. God Himself is not a self-promoting God. God is a humble God. He built the kingdom. He created us. He created this world system to operate off of humility. So when you get into pride, you just are outside of what God created you to be. It's like taking a person and putting them in water. And you know what? You weren't made to live in water. And if you get into water and if you don't have a breathing apparatus or something like that, you're going to die. Not because God intentionally is against you. It's just He created you to breathe air, not to breathe water. You take a fish out of water and take him and bring him out into the air, and he'll die because he's out of his element. God created us to operate in humility. And when you get into pride, God is resisting you. His whole kingdom is against you. And it really is pride that we want to do these things. So when it says that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth, that's an amazing statement. But what makes that even more amazing is that Moses is the one who wrote that. And most people think that if you're truly humble, you'll never know it. That humble people, they look at it as people that are beat down, and they just don't acknowledge anything good. I heard a story about a church that took a vote to find out who the most humble person was. And so they took a vote and everybody agreed. It was dear old brother so-and-so. So on Sunday morning, they brought him up and gave him this big button, a red button with white letters on it that said humble. And they gave him this huge button because he was the most humble person in the church. And because he accepted it, they took it away. If you were truly humble, you would never acknowledge that. And that's what a lot of people think humility is. But here's Moses writing, and he says, I'm the most humble person on the planet. Did you know if God would have shown him that, and it is said, I wouldn't say that, because what would people think? Then that's not true humility. True humility isn't debasing yourself. It's just saying about yourself what God says. If God says that you can lay hands on the sick and they'll recover, and if you think, oh, I could never do that, that's pride. I had a guy come up after I was teaching on this. This has been 30-something years ago. And he came up to me and he says, look, I've enjoyed you and I've gotten things out of your ministry, but you're wrong on this. He said, I am one of the most angry people you'll ever meet. He says, nobody likes me. He says, I can't keep any relationships going. I have problem after problem after problem, but I do not have pride. He said, I have such low self-esteem that nobody thinks worse of themselves than me. And he says, so I don't have pride. You can't say that pride is what causes me to be angry. But that's because he was misdefining pride. Pride isn't just arrogance. Low self-esteem is pride. I was an introvert. I couldn't look at a person in the face and talk to them. I used to have serious problems. I remember as a senior in high school, a guy walking down the street and saying, good morning. And I was 2 blocks down the street, sitting in my car, and finally I said, good morning. I couldn't even say hi to a person. I was so introverted. And you know what it was? It was pride. And some people think, well, how do you see that? Because I wasn't thinking about the other person. I was always thinking about me. I was afraid that I was going to say or do something wrong and that it wouldn't come across right. And I was just paralyzed by fear about whether people would accept me. I wanted to be accepted. People with low self-esteem are extremely prideful people. You are focused on yourself. That's all you think about. And I can say that with conviction because I've been there. When I started in ministry, I ministered for at least 2 years, and it was like pulling teeth, and it was hard. And it was so bad that I even promised the Lord after every time I ministered, God, I'll never embarrass you or me again by ministering again. And I just couldn't forbear. It's like Jeremiah said, it was like fire shut up in my bones, and I'd have to get up and just try again. But I mean, it was a struggle. And finally, I had a guy walk up to me after I ministered one time, and he says, you know, you've got some really good things to say. And he said, if you ever got more concerned about the people you're ministering to than you were about yourself and what they thought about you, you could be a blessing. And man, that was like a dagger stuck in my heart, but it was true. And I understood, and I realized that that's what the problem was. I was ministering for me. I was ministering for my approval. I was wanting people to accept me. And I think that nearly every minister goes through this in the beginning because you're trying to establish yourself and you are concerned about whether you're going to be able to minister effectively. And so maybe it's just something you have to grow through. But boy, that was a turning point in my ministry when I got more concerned about the people I was ministering to than I was about myself. So just being focused on yourself, looking at everything, thinking about God, how is this going to affect me? That's the root of all of this strife. And it's the only reason that you get angry. It's the only reason that you have contention is because you are so alive to yourself and so thinking about yourself. So the antidote to all of this strife isn't fixing your mate. And again, this is what so many marriage seminars are all about, is how you can fix your mate. And you tell people that you need to treat your mate this way and treat your mate that way. And all of those things are true. Again, conversation is important and remembering anniversaries and things are important. All of that stuff has its place. But if you just peel back the layers, if you love the other person more than you loved yourself, and if you thought about them and you wanted their success more than you want your success, it would solve those problems. So really, I believe that one of the keys in marriage is just learning how to die to yourself, how to put God and other people, your mate first. And if you do that, then you just diffuse strife. You just take care of things. You know, Jamie and I were talking about this morning, and I was telling her, I said, man, I wish you could minister. She could probably do better on this than I could. But she was saying, is there things I do that bother you? And we just moved into a new house. And anyway, we've been living in this other house for 38 years or something like that, and we just about got everything figured out, and everything was working. But in this new house, we have this little thing that you put your toothbrush in and your toothpaste in. And anyway, I hadn't got the words to describe it, but the way she puts the toothpaste in there, every time I have to take the toothpaste thing out before I can get my toothbrush. And I've thought, all she has to do is turn it the other way and it would work. And I've thought about telling her this. And the Lord spoke to me and He says, is it a real problem to turn the toothpaste around instead of having to tell her about it? Now, I know that this is a small thing, but this is the kind of stuff that you get contention coming out of. You're looking at things only from your perspective. And the Lord told me, He says, you can turn that thing around without having to tell Jamie that she has to put her toothpaste in there differently. And, you know, I just had somebody give me this watch back in May, I think it was, and there's a charger that this thing goes on. And anyway, this charger not only charges my watch, but it has another plug-in to charge something else. So anyway, I plugged it in at my sink in our bathroom, and that was real convenient for me. Jamie saw that it had this other thing. She says, oh, this will also charge this other thing in the kitchen. So she put that charger in the kitchen. So every night, it's only been a couple of months, and nearly every single night I walk in and get ready to go to bed, and this is the last thing I take off, and I always have to walk back to the kitchen. And I've thought about saying something, and the Lord said, you get up and walk on the treadmill, you walk miles every day, is it going to hurt you to walk into the kitchen and put this up? Those are small things, but see, this is the kind of stuff that contention comes over as you looking at things only from your perspective. Is it going to hurt me to walk into the kitchen to plug in my watch? Is it going to hurt me to turn this toothpaste tube around so that it doesn't block my toothbrush? Don't look at me in that tone of voice. I can guarantee you this is the kind of stuff that just little foxes spoil the vine, and little things add up and they aggravate us. And when it comes right down to it, it's because you just are thinking about yourself. And there's something more important than you. You're supposed to think more highly of other people than you think of yourself. You're supposed to put other people first. And I tell you, the only way that this can happen is if you have a relationship with the Lord to where you have bowed the knee, you've made Him Lord, and you've come to the end of yourself. And Dwayne and I were talking about this with Jacob yesterday on a podcast that we did, but I think that very, very, very few people have ever come to a place to where honestly it's not all about you. Most of us are just self-centered and focused on ourselves and thinking about ourselves and promoting ourselves, have the attitude that if we don't defend ourselves, if we don't take care of this, who will? God will. Amen. God will take care of you better than you'd take care of yourself. You know, I had a nationally known minister, I won't call their name, but if I called their name, everyone of you in here would know who I'm talking about. And they went on television, they went before their church and told everybody I'm the slickest cult since Jim Jones, and that they made people in their church burn my tapes and books. And every year for multiple years, I think for close to a decade, they had people, they brought in their leadership and taught them that Andrew Wommack is of the devil, and you make sure that nobody in any of your classes has any of his stuff. And anyway, I knew about all of this. I was actually in their city when they announced this. And Jamie and I were planning on going to their church that morning, and at the last minute, we just changed and went to somebody else's church, a friend of ours. But my staff was sitting all on the front row when this person said all these things. And so people wanted me to respond, and you know what? I don't know why they said what they said. I don't know. You don't know why people do what they do. You know, when the scripture says, judge not that you be not judged, I don't think that means that you never discern or make a judgment. It's just telling you to be careful, because with the same judgment that you judge, you'll be judged. And there's other scriptures where He rebuked the churches in Revelation because they didn't judge Jezebel, because they didn't do this. There are scriptures where Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, being absent, I've already judged concerning him that has done this action. This isn't saying that you don't judge. It's just saying you need to be careful, because the same way that you judge other people, you're going to be judged. So anyway, I don't know why this person said what they said. I can sit there and say I believe they're wrong, amen, but I don't know why they did. So I didn't get mad at them, and I didn't do anything against them. And anyway, their church got into some problems, and they sent out a letter, and I was on their mailing list. And I sent them a $1,500 gift, which back 30 years ago was a lot of money for me. And I gave and I helped them, and I've never spoken against them. I've never called their name publicly, told anybody about them. And I just forgave them because that's what the Lord said to do. And anyway, it was 20 years later or something. I was on TBN with them, and they were a guest on TBN, and I was a guest on TBN. And we were in the green room together. And I was wondering how this was going to go. And they came up to me and they said, "Oh man, I watch you every day on television. I just love it. I love your ministry." And I was sitting there thinking, what's going on? And they're getting older. And I'm thinking maybe they got Alzheimer's. I don't know what it is. But we become good friends, and they've come and they've ministered at my Bible college. And they've given me their personal, and they asked Jamie and me to come stay with them at their house if you ever need some time away. And they just love me now. I don't know how that happened, but God fixed it. I had another man that was on the board of directors of the Full Gospel Businessmen in Lamar, Colorado, and he hated me and used to tell people that I was a cult, and I told people to burn my books and stuff like this. And I knew about it. I never personally met this guy, but I heard about it. I didn't go meet him, and what he was saying wasn't true, and so I just let it go and cast my care about it over on the Lord. And anyway, I came to Colorado Springs, and this friend of mine, Joe Ney, was holding meetings and for 7 days at a Full Gospel Businessmen's Convention with about 700 people there. And every service, morning and night, he acknowledged me and had me get up and just greet the people and say something. So I said something, and would just minister for a couple of minutes. And then the last night, in front of 700 people, as he invited me up to say something, this guy who had told people that I was of the devil and hated me and all of these things, he came running up on the platform and fell at my feet and started crying and holding my boots. And he apologized, and he says, "I'm so sorry for everything I've done." And he says, "I've said all these things, and then here I come, and for 7 days I've been hearing Joe promote me." And he repented publicly in front of all of these people. I couldn't have ever made that happen. God will defend you and take care of you if you will let Him do it. But did you know when you start defending yourself, you exempt God from this process? I remember our youngest son, Jonathan Peter, he didn't talk until he was 3. And that was the same with me. They took me to the doctor and asked, if something was wrong. And this doctor examined me and he says, "Why should he talk? He's got 4 people that all he's got to do is point and grunt and he gets anything he wants." And my first memory that I have is wanting a glass of milk, and they set it on top of the refrigerator, and he says, "You aren't getting it until you say milk." And I fell on the floor and started crying. That's the first memory that I have, 3 years old. I knew that the jig was up. I had to start talking. So my youngest son was like that. And anyway, I was trying to get him to talk, and we were coming out of this restroom, and the door really had a heavy closer on it, and he couldn't open it. And so he was pulling on that thing, and then he put his foot up on the door trying to pull, which of course was counterproductive. And so he looked up at me. And I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to open the door. And I said, "You got to talk." And he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't say anything. But he also wouldn't take his hands off of that. He had both hands on the doorknob like this. And I said, "I can't open this door until you let go." And as soon as I said that, the Lord spoke to me and He says, "That's the way I feel about you. I can't solve these problems until you let go of it, until you turn it over to me." And so actually our self-will, our pride, our wanting to defend ourselves and promote ourselves is what's hindering God from operating in marriage we're talking about and dealing with that other person. The first lady that ever became a general manager of my ministry, this is back when we were in Lamar, Colorado, and it's a long, long story. I hadn't got time to go into it, but her first husband died. She was left with 2 kids. And she walked into a Daylight Donut shop, and a man walked up to her she had never seen and said, I'm God, and if you'll worship me, I'll solve all your problems, and prophesied to her that her husband had died and that she had all of these things, and she didn't know the Lord, and so she wound up submitting to him and married this guy. And it turned out he was a demon worshiper. He would leave his body and bark at the moon and levitate tables, and he broke her neck one time. He took a butcher knife to her and poured hot grease over her. And the time that I met her, she was living in the same apartment complex, and her kids from the 2 previous marriages had to stay in the basement. And if they ever came out of the basement, he threatened to kill them. And they snuck up into the kitchen to get some food. And he found them, and he was yelling and screaming and had a butcher knife. And so she had taken the kids, and the police had separated them on the lawn. And anyway, that's the way. So the people that own the apartment complex came to my Bible studies, and they asked me to come talk to her. And they said, tell her she doesn't have to live with this guy. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you have to stay in an abusive marriage. But when they began to tell me the story and says, tell her that she doesn't have to stay with him. So I just told her, I said, you don't have to stay with him. About that way. Because the scripture says, if he's pleased to dwell with you, don't depart. Well, he wasn't pleased to dwell with her, and I said, you're free to depart. And she says, but? And I said, but it's just the devil in him. And she had just gotten born again a month before that. And I said, God can turn this situation around. I said, it's your choice. You don't have to stay. If you feel like it's putting your life and your kids in danger, you're free to go, but you don't have to go. I said, it's just the devil in him, and now you have God in you. This woman decided to stick with him, and she became the general manager of my ministry, and every day she'd come tell me all the terrible things that had happened, and I began to teach her these same things. I said, look, the reason that you've been so hurt is because you are so concerned about yourself. I said, you can get to a place to where you love him more than you love yourself. And I would imagine that the majority of people, Christians, Spirit-filled Christians sitting right here would disagree with what I'm saying right here. But you know what? I just began to teach her that you can love him. Where's he coming from? What's happening? And anyway, as she began to start delving into this guy was raised in Jamaica. He was dedicated to the devil at birth.